Hello and welcome to the Republic of Azo. I am your host, Zach Yost. Today I'm very excited for our guest, Tony Gill, who is joining us for what might be something of a Christmas-themed episode where he'll be talking about his work on gifting, but also tipping and more broadly his work on the political economy of religion and what sort of social function religion plays, and what makes what are the ingredients that make a religion successful and likely to endure through time. So Anthony Gill is a professor of political science at the University of Washington, a distinguished research scholar at Baylor University's Institute for the Study of Religion, and a member of the Mount Pelerin Society. He is the author of Rendering unto Caesar and The Political Origins of Religious Liberty. While still writing on religious liberty, Professor Gill's current research agenda examines the endurance of religious institutions, user-generated governance systems, and norms and rituals in coordinating economic behavior. Tony Gill has recently published articles on tipping, gifting with Michael Thomas, and why religious institutions are effective in governing society. He teaches courses in political economy, public choice, and religion and politics, and earned the UW's Distinguished Teaching Award in 1999. Tony also enjoys boxing, hiking, scuba diving, camping, billiards, target shooting, The Who, and all things cowboy. His favorite color is royal blue, and will consider you a friend forever if you buy him a bourbon with one big ice cube. So you can find more of his work at anthonygill.org. Welcome back, everyone, to the Republic of Azo. Today I'm very glad to be joined by Tony Gill, who is a political scientist who does a lot of work on political economy of religion, and recently had a very interesting paper called The Dynamic Efficiency of Gifting, co-authored with Michael D. Thomas, come out. And since this episode should be out right before Christmas, it's quite fitting for the season, and he's going to tell us what it's all about. Thanks so much for being here, Tony.
It's great to be here, especially this time of year. It's a fun time of year to be talking about gifting and religion and a whole mess of other stuff.
Exactly. And how gifting is not a waste, which is what some economists have argued for a few decades, that it'd be better if we just gave cash. Giving people ugly sweaters they'll never wear is a big waste, and we're all just irrational people, is what was what the mainstream, I suppose, take is. So where do you depart from that?
Well, let me explain that a little bit more, because that was certainly a bah humbug for the time, and it's oftentimes difficult to sell students on this notion that gifting creates deadweight loss, which is an argument that Professor Joel Waldfogel made back in the early 1990s, 1993, in the American Economic Review. And I happen to think that that article was a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but a lot of people have run with it recently, including Tyler Cowen and Alex Tabarrok had a recent video telling you that, oh, when you give a gift to somebody and they don't want it, it's an ugly cat sweater and it sits in the back of their closet, that's deadweight loss. It's really bad to have that kind of thing in a society, because they don't match their preferences. It would just be so much better if you just gave people cash, because then they could buy what they want. And when I started teaching this back in 1994 in some of my political economy classes, and as a kind of a neoclassical economist, I understood the whole inefficiency argument, and but the students looked at me like, you're absolutely crazy. Like, yes, we've gotten bad gifts, but come on, you're such a Grinch, and you're a Scrooge. What is with you? And it was fun just thinking about this over the several decades. And Michael Thomas, who's at Creighton University, and I just got together one time and said, "Oh, we need to, write something together. We our thoughts are on the same wavelength." And we tossed out this gifting idea, and our counter response to all the bah humbug gifting creates dead weight loss, this waste in society. People get things they don't want. They could have been produced for other things. Is that it's really the process of giving that creates efficiency. So yes, you might get something that is not very useful for you, but what you're also getting is a signal from the other person that they're willing to sacrifice some of their resources to show you that they care. And this is really, really, really important for a market economy. And I take this back to Adam Smith, who said the reason why nations flourish, why they become wealthy, is because we trade with one another. And when we trade with one another and expand our trade networks, we encounter people that we don't trust or we don't know about. I shouldn't say that we don't trust, but people that we're uncertain. They're anonymous or quasi-anonymous, and we do need to trust them if we're going to interact with them. And so society, Michael Thomas and I have argued that society builds in these little trust building rituals that says, hey, I'm willing to sacrifice some resources for you to show you that I care. And if anything ever goes wrong in our relationship in the future, I've already burned some resources. So I can make it good in the future. And that is really, really important. It's the moral fabric that really ties together market economies that you don't see in those neoclassical, fancy formal models and statistical analyses.
The dismal science side of
it is, and I tend to be very optimistic and bullish on market economies, and I love people interacting and stuff, but to sell them on that neoclassical, well, preferences are not matched efficiently and we haven't reached the equilibrium and it's really horrible, and this is bad for society, we should just give gift cards or cash or something like that. Most people stare at you like, yeah, you scientists don't know anything about what you're talking about. And that's probably true. We get too narrowly focused and we don't look around at the broader cultural aspects, and economists have poo-pooed the cultural, these rituals. They seem all silly, and that's something an anthropologist or a sociologist study, and it's silly stuff. We're focused on the dollars and cents here. But it really, if you think about it in that dynamic sense, gifting creates a ritualistic pattern of people showing that they care for one another, that they're willing to make amends if something goes wrong. And also we practice graciousness. I mean, this is something we don't think about too in gifting. And economists say, oh, it's a transfer of resource to one person to another. But there's that, graciousness and response. It could be a simple reciprocity like, oh, thank you very much. I really appreciate you thinking about me. Or it could actually be more substantial, is that, oh, you gave me a gift, I'm going to give you a gift. You came over to my house for a party and brought a bottle of wine. The next time that I have a party, you bring a bottle of wine, etc. And again, that creates a much richer fabric with which in markets actually exist, which makes us trust one another. When you see people, out shopping and the stores are decorated and, they're singing carols and they're giving each other wrap presents, you say, people are pretty good. I feel like I could, just go out into the society and go to a shop or a store that I don't know anything about, and they'll give me fair treatment because they're part of this society that engages in these gifting rituals.
Yeah, I think that makes a lot of sense. When I was an undergrad, I recall my econ professor mentioning the dead weight loss thing. And my argument at the time. I was like, well, it's not just the receiver, it's the giver also gets something out of it. But that was that was the extent of my sophisticated rebuttal. So with like Christmas, I find Christmas fascinating in um, well, in lots of regards, but in one particular way, the way it's which it's spread around the world to non-Christian societies as well. I mean, Christmas is a big thing in Japan and also in Vietnam, I know, and it's just sort of, uh, I suppose, it just is great to have these sort of a big festival, really, of like trust building, I suppose
Yeah.
you could say.
It,
Now, oh, go ahead.
I was going to say, yeah, one of the things that spurred us into writing this paper as well, too, is that, economists who love efficiency so much, make the argument that gifting is not very efficient, creates all this dead weight loss and blah. But they also make arguments that inefficient institutions and cultural practices will be pushed out over time.
Oh, yes, yeah.
If you look at gifting, though, gifting has been an ubiquitous cultural institution across time and space. Every culture has some gifting ritual built into it. And you see this deep back in history. Anthropologists have tried to study this. Why has this been going on for, centuries and millennia? And different rituals can have different more effectiveness than some others. And I hadn't thought about Christmas spreading to other parts of the world. In part, it's because Christianity has expanded in some parts. But as you mentioned, places like Japan or Vietnam, it's Christianity really hasn't gotten a big toehold there, but they love Christmas. And I think this might be the case that Christmas satisfies a number of important features in a gifting ritual that makes it very efficient. For example, it's very public. Everybody knows that everybody else is giving to one another. So even though we might exchange gifts in private behind closed doors, nobody knows what, if I give you a gift, they don't know what it is. If you give me a gift, they don't know what it is. But we all know that we're all doing it and that we're sacrificing resources. And it's not just the gift too. It's the ribbons and the wrapping paper and all the, ornaments. And I mean, there's a lot of sacrifice of your time and your energy that goes into the whole Christmas gift giving ritual. And I often ask students about this too, just as a kind of a gut way to test all this. Say you're walking down, Main Street, and you see restaurants and some storefronts. They're all decorated. They paint snowman on the window, and they got garland. And you look at that, and it, first of all, it makes you smile. It's kind of nice. What that is saying is that this restaurant owner, this shopkeeper, is willing to spend a couple hours to decorate because they want to be part of the community. And they're burning some resources, their time, their labor, the fact that they got to store all this garland and these lights for another year is telling them that, I care about people and I'm willing to, if anything goes wrong with your pizza, I'll make it good for you again. But if you walked down the street and came across a store that didn't have any of that, I mean, all of a sudden you go, what's going on here, right? It's that kind of gut test. It's like, yeah, I kind of want to go to the store that's all decorated nice, and I mean, that's the person probably cares a little bit more about their business and about me, and I'll reciprocate by caring a little bit more about them.
Yeah, and would you say it's sort of by providing a framework for participating in these sort of public rituals, the person doesn't even have to really go along merrily and cheerfully. It's just the fact that they are participating, however begrudgingly, that I guess you would argue signals that they are they can be counted on to adhere to norms and things like that.
I think that's true. In one of the many people I've come across, and a lot of academics actually say, I hate gifting. It's just such a pain and but they do it anyways, right? And I don't know if these folks are all as Scrooge-like as they seem to be, but it is the ritualistic aspect that we're all going to do this together on a certain date, and there's going to be certain types of things you do, wrapping things, putting it in bows, exchanging cards, and that it's very public. it basically is testing people. Do you want to be part of this broader community? And the folks that don't, the folks that are Scrooges, they are they set themselves aside, and there are consequences. There are costs for not participating in the typical norms of society, and it weighs on your reputation. Another good example, Michael Thomas and I wrote a short piece on this about Halloween. And that's another gifting ritual that we don't think, well, kids run around, knock on doorbells and say trick or treat, and then somebody gifts them some candy or something. And then the kids are supposed to respond, thank you. One, we're teaching kids about graciousness, right? That people will sometimes give unto themselves, but be gracious about it. But the public signal there too. And you think about growing up, Halloween, there was always that one house that turned off all the lights. They didn't participate, right? That's not the person you go to if your lawnmower is broken and you need to borrow something, right? You go to the person who decks everything out with, ghosts and inflatable monsters and stuff like that, who give out the, the really good Snickers bars and stuff. And in part because they're trying to say, hey, we're part of this community. We want to be a very generous and giving part of it. We want to celebrate with you and have a lot of fun. That's the person I want to, quote unquote, do business with or be sociable with.
Yeah. I have two other sort of points on the gifting that I'm curious for your thoughts on. The first is, and I think you sort of touch on this some at the conclusion of the paper, sort of like, it'd be interesting if people try and map like social trust in societies to how much giving they participate in. And I sort of think of how some cultures have like this norm of like, you want to be the one to pay the check at the restaurant. And it's sort of funny because I've run into like, I have a friend who's Arab, and like once I paid the check and he was like, oh my goodness, you like pulled one over on me, and stuff like that. So it's just sort of, I think that would be fascinating to try and map these gifting things. And then my other question is, that's a little morbid, I suppose, though, is it sort of seems that this same way of thinking might be applied to how cultures would leave material things with graves of people. I mean, ranging from the pyramids to very primitive, I suppose, even like Stone Age cultures and things. I'd never thought of that, but that seems to make a lot of sense.
Yeah, let me address that latter question first. And it's a great example of this. A student brought this to my attention too very recently. They said, yeah, we go to our grandparents' graves, and we they oftentimes, they're from a culture that left fruit. And I'm sure some coyote came around and ate the fruit or something like this. Other people, and I've seen some people, a friend of mine went to their parents' grave recently and left flowers, right? And again, it's showing that I'm sacrificial. Now, it's a very personal moment. It's like, oh, I want to remember my grandfather or grandmother and, honor them in such a way. And you do that. And even though it's still private, other people do it, because you drive past a graveyard or a cemetery, you see other people doing this. We have memorial services, right? Veterans Day or Memorial Day, I should say, when, people go to Arlington and put flowers, for all the people who have fallen. It says, we're sacrificing. We're not going to, forget you in the long run. And that's, I don't want to be forgotten in the long run. And so it's a really kind of nice thing. And again, it shows that people are more than just, thin utility maximizers that are just trying to meet efficiency. They say, I want to actually engage with society broadly. Trust me, I'm a good person to do this. I'll remember you, you remember me, and everything will be great. The question about testing this and measuring it all is rather difficult. And Michael Thomas and I have batted this around a little bit, because every culture has some variance of this, right? And our thesis, our argument basically says that where gifting rituals are much more public, are much more reciprocal, are much more ritualistic and sacrificial, there'll be more trust in that society. So the first thing is measuring trust, which is
Yeah.
really difficult. And we have surveys. Do you trust the person next to you? And how much do you trust the government or this institution or that institution? Okay, so yeah, we have some decent cross national data on that. But it's the gifting that's really difficult, because gifting comes in so many different forms. It's easy to think about Christmas and, to talk about it this time of year. It resonates with everybody. But there are other cultural practices, like you mentioned, is like, paying the bill at a restaurant. And there's a cultural dance to that. It's the elder person, or, this person, or there might be, you paid last time, I paid this time. There's other types of, at times when you do this kind of gifting in New Year's, or China does a lot of Chinese New Year's with these red envelopes, and there they actually give cash to,
Right. Yeah.
which is very interesting and something that we don't fully understand. But yeah, leaving fruit at a graveside, there's so much of this that actually goes on that I think it can be studied. It's possible to be studied. It's a pretty big project. And for anybody out there who wants to study this, get in contact with us. I'd be happy to give my blessing on this in terms of your dissertation or thesis or whatever it might be.
And I just remembered now that you've done work on this elsewhere, but like tipping, would tipping be considered gifting? Where does tipping fall? Because I suppose that could be a signal as well, sort of.
Absolutely. In fact, the whole gifting project ramped up from my interest in tipping, and this was another thing that I talked with students about. And tipping is one of these institutions that occurs in some countries, but not others. It tends to be an Anglo-Saxon type of ritual, spreading to where the British Empire has been, but with some exceptions too. But we have a lot of students from Asia here out at the University of Washington, and they're very perplexed by tipping and why you do this. It seems odd. And I've, again, in my classes, it's a great way to teach a number of different concepts. One is, how we solve the principal agent problem. That's the very, simple economic explanation that if you can't monitor somebody's performance directly, how do you incentivize them to do a good job? Well, tipping does that. If the restaurant manager can't be watching their service staff all the time to make sure that they're happy and refilling water glasses and picking up the customer cues, let the customer kind of reward them or punish them according to their service. And if the wait staff understands that, they want to get a big tip because that's going to, benefit them financially. They understand. So that's solving what we call a principal agent problem. But there's a bigger puzzle. And this was something actually I read in Milton Friedman's, one of his book, it might have been Free to Choose, where he said, it's a puzzle, though. If you think that tipping solves the principal agent problem, why would anybody tip at a restaurant that they know they're never going to go back to again? Right. So if I go to a bar and I know I'm going to be a longtime customer there, I tip very well because I want them to pay attention to me, fill my drink up when it's empty, and correct mistakes that happen on my food order or something like that. That we can easily explain. But if you're driving across country, you stop at a roadside diner, you're never coming back here again. Why would you leave a tip? Right? You're supposed to leave 20%. So maybe you got to, drop a $20 bill on a $100, bill that you received in a receipt. So why would you? But people do. And that's the puzzle. And in part because this is a social norm. The social norm, like gifting, says, this is an instance where we need to sacrifice. You don't have to do this. And there's some social pressure to do it. You don't have to, but it's a good idea to think of the other person, to reward them for the service that they provided for you. And again, it is a gift. You think nobody's required to tip. So, in that regard, it comes from your own voluntary actions. But on the other hand, it's a ritual. It says, no, you need to practice this sacrificial act. You don't have to do it, but you should do it because it shows you're a good person. You're treating other people well. And those people will treat, the people who receive that tip will treat, the next person that comes into the restaurant well as well. I mean, your service was really contingent upon, people tipping that came before you. Right. So if it's a restaurant at the national park where you get a lot of, transitory, individuals that will never come back to the restaurant again, the fact that a lot of people were tipping before you came in is, tells the server to be really nice to you. And that's really good. And again, that's a big, huge social signal that actually makes markets work.
Yeah. Now, I found so I developed an appreciation for tipping after I worked in the service industry. But I have found that I think we actually chatted about this at Markets and Society a little bit, how with COVID and everything, people are tipping more generously. And I found I I don't tip I don't tip poorly for poor service, because it sort of seems that I don't know, it's just like the restaurant industry as a whole right now is so messed up. I mean, it's go to restaurants, huge shortages of people, it's like, well, the waitress is probably trying her best, I think. I hope, but it's just, the kitchen is short and whatnot. So how do you think that and even also like millennials like myself have a horrible time complaining about anything, like we hate to send our food back. So do you think that could there could be a shift in tipping norms to where it's just, oh well, it's 20% even if this person did a horrible job? Or do you have any thoughts or info or insights into that?
Yeah, COVID is a big kind of a break in society that allows us to rethink this a little bit. But let me go to pre-COVID days and wag my finger at you that if you get bad service, you should not tip very well. And I know, I've run across people who said, "Oh, I feel obligated because it might just be a bad day for the wait staff." And okay, I get that, but tipping is an important signal to tell somebody if they're horrible at customer service, they shouldn't be working that job.
No.
Right? At the end of the day, you're not collecting a whole lot of tips, and the person next to you is. You do one of two things. You turn to the person and say, "Wow, you got a lot more tips. What are you doing that I'm not?" And they say, "Oh, you got to pay attention to refilling their water glasses, or if they're tapping their fingers, they probably need to get to the theater really quick. So make sure they get their bill right away." You learn that way. But on the other hand, if your tips are still pretty miserable, it's like, you're not a service industry kind of person. Maybe you should become a computer programmer. No offense to you computer programmers, but I've known some of you. No, it's a good way of weeding people out. And it sounds horrible that somebody's going to lose their job, but if you're not good in your job, find something else. Now the COVID thing. One of the things that I have noticed, and I've played experimental games with my students in class where we ask them to divide up money and then offer it to somebody else, and they can decide whether they take it or not. The last 2 years has been really odd. Coming out of COVID, students are significantly more generous than they have been in the past, and that just absolutely surprised me. And what you said about oh man, the restaurant industry was messed up during COVID. You feel really bad for these folks. A lot of them lost jobs, or the hours that they worked were down. And so, I mean, this is in part and parcel a response to show that tipping is actually working as it should be in society, because people are saying, yeah, you're facing a really hard time. It's my turn to sacrifice. I have a job. I'm still working it. You're having a rough time. I'm going to throw in 25% now. I'm going to make sure that you can get through this COVID period, because things are very rough for you. That's exactly what should be happening, and it's kind of nice to see that. And I've seen people who were very anti-tipping before COVID saying, "Oh, I kind of really understand the importance of this now. That in dire times we need to sacrifice unto ourselves to give to others." To get them through hard times, and in many ways that's the beautiful thing. Now I think a lot of folks are picking this up, especially younger folks. I was very heartened to see this in my the casual experimental results. I haven't done anything formally It couldn't pass muster in an academic journal, but it's kind of neat to see. And I think it does. It's one of these, moments in history that really kind of proves what we were talking about before. So, hate to go through the COVID thing, but yeah, maybe people are a little bit more giving and generous because of it, hopefully.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, that makes a ton of sense. So now I just wanted to move on to your other work, based broadly about the political economy of religion. I attended most of your talk at Markets and Society, and it was very refreshing to hear religion mentioned. It is a blind spot for lots of people in our circles. I find just if it's not outright hostility like Ayn Rand level, religion is evil. It's more just sort of like, oh, this quaint sort of institution. But as you've argued, it's a very enduring institution, and two, it fulfills a lot of functions that, one, it's historically fulfilled, but two, that the state is bad at fulfilling. And you are quite bullish. You don't think religion's going anywhere, contrary to some naysayers.
Yeah, and I could give you the history of this too. When I originally was in graduate school and looking for a topic, I just wanted to find something easy to do to get the initials, and I just did a simple comparison of Catholic episcopacies in Latin America and their political stances. But when I was hired at the University of Washington, a faculty member, very significant, prominent faculty member, pulled me aside and said, that religion stuff's really cute. Get a book out of it, but then move on to something more important. And as a junior faculty, I said, oh, yeah, okay, I'll do that. I started thinking about this, right? I go, okay, so in political science, in political economy, we're interested in studying, things like governments, and why they, rise and why they fall. I was very interested in revolutionary movements that topple governments, or why military coups, undercut democratic regimes and all these things. And it kind of occurred to me is that if we're interested in governing structures and how long they last, isn't it odd that we don't think about religion? Because what is the most historically enduring formal hierarchy in human history? It's the Catholic Church. Right? It goes back, you could say 2,000 years. Some people say, well, it started around the Council of Nicaea, officially 1,700 years formalizing. Okay, I'll give you those 300 years, right? But it's been around for a long period of time. And wherever the Pope goes, there's millions of people that show up to see the Pope. And there's 1 billion Catholics, right? And it's not just the Catholic Church as a formal hierarchy that has, the appointed levels and chain of command and stuff. If you think less formally, Hinduism is the oldest religion in the world, 5,000 years, and you still have millions and millions of people adhering to that. Judaism, 3,500 or so years of that going strong against immense persecution. And then the new kid on the block, Islam, has only been around for about 1,400 years, right? And there's some religions that come and go, but the big main religions have really kind of endured for a long time. And I turned to my colleagues, I said, if we want to know why institutions succeed, wouldn't we want to look at religion? Because it guides people behavior, right? This is what governments are supposed to do. It tells people what they should do, what they shouldn't do. And if we want to understand the new social movements that everybody's raving about, how about these old social movements like Hinduism and Judaism, right? And when you ask that question, they're like, oh yeah, and they say, yeah, well, church attendance is down 5% over the last decade. And I'm like, 5%? I'm sorry, there's still 1 billion Catholics, right? And I can tell you that I'm probably not going to be around, but the Catholic Church is going to be around in 30 years, right? There's been so many prognostications that, Nietzsche said religion is dead. The secularization theorists in the past few decades, this is the end of religion now. You heard this in the colonial Americas. The reason we had a first Great Awakening is because there was a first sleeping. You aren't going to church enough, kids. That them to wake up, and they woke up. And you
Yeah.
can even go back to Revelation in the Bible, and you got the writer there, complaining about all these churches that are really sucking. Right? You're doing
Mhm.
a bad job. Religion's at its end. Dude, buck up, people. And Paul even wrote epistles to people. Come on.
Yeah.
So religion's not going anywhere. And the big question is, why does it have that staying power?
Yeah, I think that's just a really great point that we so often fail. Like, as you mentioned, your colleagues just didn't think about it. I think some of it has to do with sort of like this presentism and chronological snobbery, as C.S. Lewis put it. It's sort of like a cliche, but I find it so fascinating, like, like the idea that like Cleopatra and Mark Antony are closer in us in time than they were to the pyramids,
Mm-hmm.
and it just sort of like we can't grasp like these huge swaths of time and what that really means for something to endure for so long. And it's just sort of this very strange idea of like, well, whatever's in vogue right now, that's right. The rest of human history, they were all ignoramuses.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. Now, so what would you say, what are the ingredients to a successful and enduring religion?
Yeah, so that is the big question. It's a paper that I wrote recently. It's one of my favorite papers, actually. The one I perhaps am most proud of, maybe other than this gifting paper, is that religions do a lot of things that are beneficial for society that governments do, but they do them better. I frame this in something called public choice theory, which is applying economics to understanding how politicians or political leaders make choices. So it's the science of choosing and basically organizing society. And I'm very interested in constitutional political economy, which is how governments actually create the fundamental rules. And as I started to think about this, I go, that's what religions do. And so there's three things that religions do that make them as effective as secular governments, and in the long run, more effective than governments, so that they can endure and last for thousands of years, whereas most governments can, make it at most a few centuries or so. The first thing is that religions provide public goods, and public goods are things that you need to provide collectively. That helps all of society. It benefits all of society, but most people wouldn't want to contribute to, because you're already consuming the goods. So why would I want to do that? I want a free ride. And the thing that religions provide, that governments are also supposed to provide, is social order. They provide a series of rules. How should you behave? Right? All your thou shalts and thou shalt nots. And society needs this, because you could look at Thomas Hobbes, who said,
Yeah.
in the state of nature, we were just, Muppets on methamphetamine running around crazy, killing one another and stuff like this. Um, and his solution was, well, we need a government. We need a Leviathan to, impose order and things like this. And so his vision was all organized. And, since then too, is, this is why we have government. Well, religions have done that. You have your 10 commandments, and you have your list of, the hadith and all these other kind of, things that say you should do this and not that and behave this way. And on top of it, all religions, all successful religions, have a very simple rule about governing, which we call the golden rule. Do unto others as you would want them to do unto you. In the Christian Bible, you can find this in Matthew 7:12. And you think about that, it's like, that's the best social organizing rule ever. Like, there's a lot of things I can't anticipate, but when I run into an unknown situation, how should I behave? What should the law be? What the regulation, the rule? Well, I should do to somebody else what I would want them to do to me. Easy, right? And so religions provide this kind of general public good of social order. And in fact, many secular government laws are based upon these old religious, precepts of, don't kill one another, and, that kind of stuff. But religions throughout time too have also provided other types of what we, in the vernacular consider public goods. They provide medical care, orphanages, care for the elderly. They assist people who are down on their luck. You've been unemployed or injured or something like that. They get you through. So they provide a lot of social services. So that's the first thing that makes religions really valuable, even for people who are atheists. And that's an important part about this, is that atheists can kind of free ride on this, the general set of rules and social order that government gives us. The next thing that that religion does that helps it to endure is it governs in a way that is very, in many ways, decentralized. It has this kind of federalist nature to it. And a lot of people say, no, wait a minute. You just talked about the Catholic Church being, very hierarchical and pointy. And, at the top, you got the Pope and then some cardinals and archbishops. And that doesn't sound very federalist and decentralizing. If you really look at how religious organizations govern, they actually involve people at the grassroots a lot. So even in the hierarchical Catholic Church, people come together weekly and they sit down and they read this book, this covenant, this constitution that says this is how you're supposed to behave. God said this, and okay. And they participate it ritualistically and reinforce the rules, but they also monitor, other people in the community. So it's this kind of cultural monitoring at the grassroots, and people develop these, community norms and community habits that help monitor one another. Say, are you staying good? Are you running according to what we're believing here in the Bible and our religious documents and stuff? So it's really kind of refreshing like that. John Locke talked about a social contract that we would get together and write the rules of society, and that's kind of really neat. Except the problem with Locke was that once that contract is written, everybody else who's born after that really doesn't have a say in it. Right. And governments try to say, oh, we want to give you civics lessons and, make you part of that governing system. But religions do this excellently. They bring you together on a regular weekly basis or bi-weekly or at certain points of time just to remind you of the rules. And it involves everybody in the community. So, again, a very resilient form of government when you think about people are participating. The last thing that religions do that secular governments don't is that initial constitution, that set of laws, the covenant, as it's often called in religious terms, is given to humanity by a divine God. And so the Constitution or the covenant, if people who run it or are in charge of telling you about this, your popes and your priests and your imams and rabbis and stuff, if they turn out to be immoral individuals, it doesn't reflect on the covenant itself. Now, here's the problem with secular governments is that, a secular constitution is written by secular people who, with all their, foibles and failures and flaws, and we're seeing that in the United States now, too, as people say, oh, maybe the Constitution is not a valid document because these people were slave owners and they were bad people and horrible. And so the Constitution is no good. Let's rip this up. Religions, though, where did the Constitution, the covenant come from? Well, God gave it to you. And I'll be the first to say that there's been a lot of religious leaders have fallen short on the job, right? A lot of popes throughout history have not been the most upstanding individuals. But that doesn't reflect on the covenant. The covenant is quote unquote perfect, given by God. And in many religions, there's that the ultimate arbitrator that, even though the Pope does something really wrong and is very sinful, it doesn't mean the covenant's wrong, and they will get their judgment in the afterlife. And that's important, that there's a true neutral arbitrator that will govern this. And again, it doesn't have to be that everybody buys into this. James Buchanan, a famous public choice scholar who wrote about this, he says, constitutions are imperfect because of the imperfect people, but it would be great if there was this institution where there was this person that existed as if everybody believed that they would be justly punished in the end. And when I was reading this in Buchanan's Limits of Liberty, I said, oh my God, James Buchanan just found religion. You flip the page and it turns out, but we don't have this. And James Buchanan was a notorious cranky atheist, didn't like religion very much. But he should have, because it was doing the things that he wanted a constitution to do. And again, doesn't mean that the executors, the people who run, the religious institution, are perfect, but the Constitution can endure that. The covenant can endure that beyond the failings of the people, and that's why I think religions have tended to endure over a long period of time.
Yeah, in your paper you mentioned the Amish, which I love. I'm, in Pittsburgh, Western Pennsylvania. I sometimes have to drive around their buggies on the road when I'm out in the country, and the Ortong and how they continually, several times a year, basically recommit to it. And people they have, when they reach a certain age, they have the choice to be baptized and agree to adhere to the Ortong, and if they don't, they're not exorcised. They're only exiled if they agree and then break it. And I have had discussions with libertarians, even way back when I was in college, and they've continued. Even I've had some this year where people find the Amish, like, they're repulsed by their social structure, which I find so confusing, because they seem to be so like the most people living the most libertarian walk. Although it depends on how you define libertarianism, I suppose. But if your libertarianism is no rules and no hierarchy, well then I can see why you don't like the Amish. But if you want, as voluntary a governance arrangement as possible, it's hard to beat the Amish. And they have a very high retention rate of something like 85 to 95%, depending where you are, of people decide to agree to the covenant, as it were.
Yeah, and that's it. One of the nice things too about the Amish, it's a great case because they allow people to exit the covenant. The Rumspringa, it's like, okay, you're 18, go to Chicago and play video games and see if you like it, right? And some of them say, yeah, I do like this, but most people come back because they offer that, the public good is the sense of community and governance that is actually very effective. I admire it so much, but I also like plugging into the network too. So it's a balance for me there. It's like, yeah, I'd love to live Amish life, but I want to have my hair dryer and television set. But
right.
But the fact that people can exit, right? And this is a part of the paper that I have to finesse a little bit, and I hope to write a book on this someday and expand on it. But religions allow people to have some degree of cultural exit. And especially in a religiously pluralistic environment, you can kind of move around. And so people say, well, there's a lot of different religions. They can't all be right. No, but if they share a kind of a general sense of thou shalt not kill one another and, just be kind, then we can all kind of understand other religious people. And you can kind of choose if you want to be in other types of religion or if you want to just opt out. And the folks that opt out can free ride on a lot of the goodwill that's created through these other religious institutions. And you even see that when, religion kind of monopolizes a certain territory, that people will just kind of, passively opt out. With secular governments, you can't do that. Secular governments are defined by not cultural space, but by geographic territory. And if I say I'm not really digging the United States military industrial complex, I'm just going to stop paying my taxes. The IRS comes knocking at my door and says, you don't really have that choice. I could pick up and go somewhere else, but that can, geographically, it's very difficult to do. So religions in many ways give you a little bit easier of an exit option. It's not complete. I mean, people are going to say, no, you're still, required to be an Anglican or a Catholic or something like that. So yeah, there is that social pressure, but the release valve is a little bit easier so that, Protestantism and actually Islam too is a good example, very decentralized religion. So if anybody got upset with one aspect of it, they can easily just move to another area, but still retain the broader, religious, covenant that they're part of. And that's what I think makes religion endure. And I have this cautionary tale at the end of the paper too, because this was much of my research for a couple decades, was that when religions attach themselves to secular states, oh, that's a bad deal, right? You got something good going when you have to kind of run this voluntarily, and the kind of cultural governance that religions tend to excel at. But the minute you associate yourself with secular powers, who are geographically constrained and can prevent people from exiting a religion and going to another one, that's when you get problems. And that's really the thing that deteriorates the authority of religion, because now your religion is the wagon is attached to that secular horse, and if they do something really bad, that reflects poorly on the religious faith. And so I've been a staunch supporter of very strict separation of church and state for most of my career, in part because religions do better when they have to do it on their own.
Yeah, and I actually realized I don't think we ever said what the name of this paper is, which is The Comparative Endurance and Efficiency of Religion, a Public Choice Perspective, which was in Public Choice in 2020. And I'm glad you brought up the state church thing, because I have been thinking about that some as well. And being Anglican, I actually have developed mixed feelings, as it were. I would be sort of sad if the Church of England was disestablished in England. But at the same time, I'm Anglo-Catholic, and Anglo-Catholicism arose from the Oxford movement, which itself arose from the disestablishment of the Church of Ireland. And what the Oxford movement people argued was basically, they're like, if the Church of England is eventually disestablished, where will we say we have our authority from? And they said our authority stems from the apostolic succession in Christ himself. So I definitely appreciate that the need for competition, because the Church of England, for one, is not is doing very poorly, and all the churches that are growing in England are not Church of England, even though there is religious pluralism there. It's just it's become so cathartic or not cathartic, arthritic rather. Yeah, and it's just like, well, we can just coast along on this state support, and it's like, well, now no one shows up to church. You have like vicars, a shortage of vicars. You have to have like one vicar, pastors, like 3 or 4 parishes. It's kind of very bad, and I definitely think establishment can contribute to that a lot.
Yeah, one of the big problems, and I've seen this in my previous research doing work in Latin America, is that when a religious institution hooks its wagon to the horses of the state, the leadership looks to the state. They become much more focused on, they're still concerned about their parishioners, but if you're getting all your funding from the government up there, you're going to want to do what the government tells you, and you don't have enough time to worry about what people at the grassroots are telling you. And oh, by the way, that's true of academics too. When we get all of our funding from the National Science Foundation, and the National Science Foundation says, we're trying to understand the politics of COVID-19 in the light of race relations and climate change. Yeah, all the scholars just rush over to do that paper, right? And we're lemmings that way. We like to think we're neutral, providers of the truth, but we go where the money is, right? But so, as I tell folks, and the lure of that, it's intense, right? And I don't blame Anglican clergy for, worrying about what the, Parliament in England is doing, because they're very concerned about what their funding is. But, on the other hand, if most of your funding, your resources, your vitality comes from the grassroots, the parishioners, you have to go in every week and say, this is why I'm important. Help us maintain that with our own with your own resources. Give to it. It's an exchange, by the way. right? It's like I
Yeah.
give you a sermon every week, and you put in a $20 bill or a euro or British pound or something like that into the collection plate. You're going to pay a lot more attention to tending your flock than if you were connected to the government. And even in the United States, where we do have a very strong disestablishment system, churches still are lured into playing politics, getting involved with political parties. And you can understand they want their policies on abortion or something in the educational system. We all have the right to kind of do that stuff. But if religious institutions become too tied to one political party or too tied to the government per se, and oftentimes getting government grants to do their good works like drug rehabilitation and stuff like that, it's going to change the nature of the institution, and I think in many ways deteriorate it. Those institutions draw their energy, their vitality from engaging the people who are their grassroots members. And for me, that's a very libertarian and in many ways very anarchistic type of message that I see the beauty in that kind of governance system, that it's hard to replicate.
Yeah, I'm not super familiar with it, but it was my understanding that before World War II, the Netherlands, like, you would be taxed to pay your tithe, and you had to register your religion, so the government would then, dole out the, your tithe, which is, I mean, crazy to think about from like an American perspective. And this was also convenient because they're like, oh, here's a list of all the Jews in the country. But yeah, that seems like a incentive disaster waiting to happen.
It is. They still do that in Germany. The Catholics and the Lutherans, or the Reformed Church, still rely on the government to collect their taxes. And it's kind of funny because you can opt out. You're kind of in it, but you have to opt out. Okay, you're secular. You don't want to pay. So when you fill out a form saying, I do not want to pay X percentage of my income to go to one of these churches, there's a cooling off period. It's almost like buying a firearm, right? It's like, whoa, let's think about this, kid. And I've heard stories, from my friends. It's like, yeah, I checked that box, and it doesn't take effect for like a couple of weeks or a month or something like that. And then all of a sudden a pastor comes by and says, hi, I saw you check the box, and would you like to get married in the church or be buried in one of our cemeteries? I'm like, ugh. So it is, in many ways, it's kind of that interesting, church-state connection that just, again, we tend to think that there's a lot of church-state separation in Europe because nobody goes to church. The reason nobody goes to church is because basically churches there are like the Department of Motor Vehicles. They're kind of government bureaucracies in many respects. It's a little bit of hyperbole, but maybe not as much as you might think.
Right. Yeah, I've seen funny posts where people will be like, we need to be more like, Scandinavia, and it's like, oh, you want an established state church? Okay. Yeah, it is odd to think about. Yeah. So one last thing before we end. A few years ago, when the Afghanistan debacle was happening, you had a piece that I thought was very, very insightful at the American Institute for Economic Research, discussing sort of the political economy of the Taliban and why, they had a lot of the success, like why their structure provided them some success. So I'd be curious if you could just go over that in a broad way of how these sort of strict religions like Mormonism and other things lead to this sort of the coherency, I suppose you might say, but also where you see religion going in the future. I mean, we talked about how you're optimistic, but do you think because I've seen some people argue we're headed in a way where it's these religions that are very make high demands of its membership that are going to be flourishing more in the future, partly because everyone else is going to die out, but just what your thoughts are there.
Yeah, let me tie all that together. The big puzzle with the Taliban in Afghanistan was, how this, and this goes back to the 1990s, is how could this ragtag band of clerics suddenly take over the government. Uh, like they don't know anything about government. They didn't study in Harvard's Kennedy School of Government and blah blah blah. Um, but they're very good at collective action. And if you want to, rule a society, you have to get a lot of people cooperating with you, including, the people who are running the actual government. You have to be able to trust them to do what they're going to do. And religious organizations, specifically very strict ones, are very good at weeding out people who are not committed to the group. So they'll have very high standards. So the Taliban, if you want to be a member in good standing in the Taliban, you got to memorize the Quran. You got to wear certain clothes. You got to have a beard. You got to dietary restrictions. Really difficult, right? And if you can do all that kind of stuff, you can be a trusted individual. And so therefore, they were one of the groups that you could rely upon in the 1990s not to be corrupt. If you have the Taliban leaders saying, just don't go pillaging villages, you need to provide electricity and other stuff to them, or as best you can. They're the ones that actually could do that. The secular governments were taking, bribes on the side. They were corrupt and, basically pillaging the society. Now, I told this to some people to say, well, but the Taliban make, women, wear strange garb and they can't drive and they don't educate them. I go, yeah, there's a lot of things that you might not like with them. But there's one thing that they do very well is that they create a very tight organization. And that's something you need if you're going to run a government. You see the same thing with Mormons are extraordinarily good at social welfare, in part because they tell their young people for 2 years you're going to go around missionizing around the globe in very hostile territory, and doors are going to slam on you. And if you don't like that, you can leave. It's kind of like the Rumspringa with the Amish. If you don't like this, you can leave. But you're gonna pay a price to get into the church, and the people who pay that price up front who make that big sacrifice are the ones that say, "Hey, I'm trustworthy. You can count on me in that regard." And the same thing happened recently in Afghanistan when we had that quick pullout. It was pretty well known that the secular government that we installed and were kind of propping up was pretty corrupt. I mean, they're flying away with pallets of cash as they're leaving the country.
And I can't get over the fact that the last president had a PhD. So
yeah. And but no surprise that the Taliban just rolled right in because they were an organized group. They knew their basic military stuff, but they were organized. And that's what you need for that kind of thing. Now, what does this tell us about the future of religion? Strict religions do very well, right? Ones that require a great deal of you. This actually ties back to gifting, in that the people who make the sacrifices for the religious organizations are the ones that you want to have in your organization. They give it a great deal of vitality. It provides a lot of social goods for people. People want to join into that. But the problem is that over time, as more people join the organization, it tends to get less strict and it tends to wane. And you just see this throughout history, the ups and downs of religions. They, at times they're doing really well, but then they institutionalize, and then there's fissures and schisms and breaks, and all of a sudden you got Protestantism, or you got Methodist breaking away from the Church of England, and Baptist and Anabaptist, all these different groups. And it's just this kind of ebb and flow that goes through things. And if you take the long haul perspective of it and just understand it from a very long-term dynamic perspective, it's really kind of a beautiful thing that teaches you about human institutions, on why they thrive, why they fail, and what the future is going to be. We're just going to have more of this in the future, I think. And we're not necessarily heading to a utopian equilibrium point in the future. We're going to have rough times, but we're going to have great times. But I think religion is going to be around, and things like tipping and gifting, where people do have to build relations before they ever engage in transactions. That's the really kind of beautiful thing that I'm doing with my study of political economy.
Yeah, thank you so much. This was, I think, a fascinating discussion. It's very suitable for Christmas time. So, Dr. Tony Gill, thank you so much for being on.
Thank you very much, Zach, and Merry Christmas to you all.
Thank you so much for joining us today here at the Republic of Azo. Be sure to subscribe and check out all the links in the description below. Thanks, and have a great day.